There's a movie from 1934 in which the male lead character, an aristocrat, seduces a servant girl. She falls into disgrace and despair. Years later, they meet again at a trial, and the man realizes that he ruined her life. To atone for his wrongdoing, he gives away all of his lands and property to his peasant workers and joins the woman who's now a convict on a march to servitude and prison labor in Siberia. I think about this movie a lot, and not just because it's a somewhat unusual story adapted from Leo Tolstoy's last novel, Resurrection. By today's standards, the film is fairly obscure, but it was a major Hollywood production at the time. Starring Academy Award winner Frederick March, directed by Ruben Mamoulian, framed by none other than cinematographer Greg Toland, who would later come to fame for his work on Citizen Kane. Much has been written about the latter and very little about the former. Our interest in cultural artifacts is not evenly distributed, and the research literature is as guilty of this as we are in our own habits of consumption. This wouldn't matter as much, perhaps, if the few mentions that we can find of, for example, this particular film, weren't littered with peculiar claims. Curiously enough, We Live Again turns up on a list of anti-communist films curated by the University of Washington libraries. To anyone who has watched the film, this classification is, to be blunt, completely absurd, and I have no idea what the reasoning for this could have been.
But what have we done to earn the right to eat from silver? Be waited on by men and women better than ourselves.
Why better than ourselves?
Because they serve.
Oh, dear, he's gone socialist.
What marvelous thoughts this writer has. You've got to read it.
What is it called?
Look.
Land and Freedom.
Uh-huh. The government has suppressed it. I've met Simonson, the author. He's a great thinker. The police are after him. But you do believe, of course, that we're all equal.
Are we?
Well, not yet, but we should be.
But then who would be servant and who would be master?
There wouldn't be any servants. We'd all be masters.
A good socialist shares with everybody. Gives his lands to the peasants, eh, Dmitri?
I thought that was a good idea once.
Oh, the muddled ideals of youth.
No, Kachagan. I was right then, and I'm wrong now.
Common wisdom would have it that most Hollywood productions at the time were part of the so-called Red Scare in the US, which culminated in the McCarthy era in the 1950s and the blacklisting of individuals, including members of the film industry, by the House Committee on Un-American Activities. But just because something seems plausible on the surface doesn't make it so. This is an issue that all scholarship in the humanities, or rather all scholarship in all disciplines, must take into account. You could argue that the social criticism in the film is framed as a response to the Great Depression more so than to function as some kind of grand political statement.
We're gluttonous and surfeited, while all about us millions go hungry.
And I find that this is also true for other literature adaptations of the time, like the 1935 version of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, which does not condone the revolutionaries, but sympathizes with the plight of the people.
The child is dead, Excellency.
It's extraordinary to me that you people cannot take care of yourselves and your children. One or the other of you is forever in the way. How do you know what injury you might do to my horses?
Be that as it may, that would only qualify any statement made to the effect of the film being pro-communist, which is the exact opposite of the categorization that we find on this list and see repeated in research literature. This is only one example for a claim that could be easily disproven if anyone cared to take a closer look at the source material. If I were to take these lists and visualize them, I would be producing questionable results, because the underlying assumptions that went into them would have already been questionable, to say the least. In order to communicate about the world, we need to use descriptors. But there's a difference between saying, "This is a glass of water," and "This is an anti-communist film." The difference isn't a difference in principle, but it is one of arguability. You don't know that this is a glass of water. You have to trust me when I tell you that it is. Since you're looking at a video right now, you have no way of confirming that it is a glass of water rather than a material that looks like glass and a liquid that looks like water. You can't touch it or taste it, and sight can be deceiving. Furthermore, while it might seem obvious to describe this object as a glass of water, our description is guided by convention. I could also simply say that it is a glass. The information that it contains water is something that I add because our interest in having a glass with a liquid in it described to us generally arises in contexts where we want to drink from a glass or use whatever it contains for some other purpose. And the glass is not just any kind of glass. It is a kind of glass that we recognize as a glass to drink from. I did not have to specify that it is a drinking glass because that again seemed obvious. I also did not specify that it is a glass for humans to drink from rather than, say, cats. The descriptors that we give usually imply a host of information that we deem the norm, and only where there are deviations from that norm do we specify further. Our point of view plays a big role in our descriptions as well, of course. To me, right now, this is a glass of water that I'm looking at. To someone dying of thirst, this would be something to save their life. If I had ordered it in a restaurant, it would be something that I would have to pay for. I'll stop there, but you get the point. Our descriptions are never complete. They can be very basic or they can be very complex. For all our concessions to subjectivity, they can also be wrong, which is not the same as to say that they cannot be ambiguous, because they can and sometimes they really should be. Essentially, there are two layers here, a material layer and a contextual layer. And the fact that I'm thinking about this in these terms right now is a conceptualization in itself. I'm trying to make sense of a perceptual expression by creating divisions, and this is a process that we might refer to as modeling. To someone who's modeling something, consciously or subconsciously, a model always fulfills a primary function in the given moment, and this function can change. It can be about the forming and shaping of something in the image of something else with no purpose other than to represent it, and it can be about the forming and shaping of something in the image of which something else ought to be formed and shaped. And these, of course, go hand in hand. But I'm not planning on going into modeling theory too deeply today. Others have done this, and some of them have been ignored by Anglophone discourses, such as the philosophers of science, who did important work on this in Germany and the Soviet Union in the 1960s and 70s. Just wanted to mention that because research literature sometimes has the unfortunate tendency to repeat and quote petrified bodies of knowledge instead of proposing new thoughts or seeking out thoughts that have already existed for a long time and would seem new if ever uncovered, given how the conversation hasn't really moved on that much. Let us return to the start. This is about making statements about something because that's how we access meaning. This something in the humanities is what we think of as cultural heritage or a record of a human presence of thought before our own. A documentation, if you will, that has manifested in material traditions. By digitizing this record, we are cycling back to very fundamental considerations about the basis of our scholarship, the medial manifestation of this basis, and the transformational processes that it goes through and that we put it through. It's no coincidence that the so-called Digital Humanities have been very document-oriented, and it stands to reason that they will continue to be. But I also think that we're in a moment right now where we are trying to figure out how to move beyond indexing the record, while never having figured out how to properly index this record to begin with. And that's a very fragile state to be in.
We have entered the age of big data. Big data may help us anticipate our future. And we cannot anticipate our future without knowledge of our past. If we want to build this magic rewind button, well, we need to transform this mushroom into a square. There are plenty of extraordinary archives around. Administrative records, personal archive, newspapers. Imagine if we could extract all the information contained in the daily newspapers for the last 200 years. Venetians were obsessed with archives. They were keeping track of everything. They were the Google of the Middle Ages.
Okay, so a few words about this notion of the record of everything. It's not everything because not everything was recorded. It's not everything because not everything that was recorded has survived. It's not everything because not everything that has been recorded and has survived has been digitized or may ever be digitized. It's not everything because not everything that has been digitized with high-quality metadata. It's not everything because even high-quality metadata inherits a point of view and is not complete. It's not everything because not everything that has been digitized can be accessed semantically, either through manual annotation or computational methods. Texts are one thing, but they are far from the only thing in the record. So, what is this everything? Most importantly, the record that we have is broken, and it has always been broken. This is not about analog versus digital or qualitative versus quantitative and all that. Those are diversions. If there's a fault, it lies in our conceptualizations, assumptions and claims, and these can come from anywhere. The Digital Humanities, insofar as this is even a distinct global field of study, which I'm not sure that it is, to be honest, at least in these broad terms, they do perhaps bring these issues to the forefront or into the light more so than traditional scholarship, which has other means of sort of papering over imprecise statements or absorbing them into the general thrust of the argument. We can debate methodology all day long, and there are several cans of worms that I'm not going to open in the short time that I have here. But really, we've got to stop with these polarizations. The Digital Humanities operate on what is already there, even if this is, at the most basic level, the record, which did not assemble itself, or something like transcriptions, which are already interpretive extractions from this record. The digitized record is also broken because it loops. It reproduces the material record at a loss, and it reproduces the knowledges about this record that were inscribed in, for example, 19th century manuscript catalogs. I had a conversation about this with Mateusz Fafinski that I want to quote from, because he's already said it so much better than I could.
I think there are two things. One is listen to the archivists. I think this is a huge problem in our field. A lot of the work that we're doing now, the archivists have done in the 90s. We should learn from what they say and what they said. And the second thing is, what can we do? I honestly, it's going to sound a bit heretical, but I honestly don't think that mass digitization is the answer. It's acknowledging the loss. I talk a lot about the loss in the paper, because loss is an inherent part of digital humanist practice and of digitization as well. A power of a conclusion is very different if you say at the beginning, hey, I am fully aware that, for example, the data I'm working with does not include this, this, and this. This is the fight against this pseudo-positivism, which tends to go the direction of, oh yes, this is a digital solution, so it's amazing, it covers all the bases. It actually doesn't. The digital solution or the digital analysis is in no way fuller than the analog one. It's just different. It allows us to see different things. So to answer your question, what can we do apart from calling for digitization of other collections or of now marginalized objects or artifacts, which we should definitely do, is to try to include in our studies and our experiments those invisible or hardly visible narratives and see what happens then.
Like he said, the digital representation of material traditions is useful in its own specific ways because it opens up other avenues of exploration. The question of accessibility is not just a nice little bonus. In fact, most of what the philologists and historians and others in the 19th century were doing when the humanities emerged as disciplines at the modern university was focused on finding ways to access the information in the record that they were assembling by visiting archives and libraries and doing archaeological excavations and all that stuff, at least in the German context wherein the discovery of cultural heritage, and especially this idea of a shared cultural heritage, was driven, in no small part, by the desire to unite in one nation. We still use the methods and tool sets they developed, like the Grotefend for decoding dating practices or Lachmanian stematological approaches to the transmission of texts. Something that's not very well known is that technology also plays a part back then in this question of accessibility, especially photography. The moment there are new developments, they're immediately applied to the facsimilization of medieval manuscripts, for example, which are published for occasions like anniversaries, but also by booksellers like Bernard Quaritch, who teams up with photographer William Griggs. I should mention that this is, as exemplified by the case of Griggs, entangled with the colonialism and imperialism at the time. And that's another aspect of the record that I don't feel equipped to address, but the questions are clear. Whose record is it? What is missing from the record because of who it was assembled by and what was deemed important by them? Whose point of view are we looking at? All of this is to say none of this is new. Here's a nice example for the loop that we're in. We can now compare the digitization of a 19th century facsimile print of a manuscript with the digitization of the manuscript made more than 100 years later. We often call these images digital facsimiles, but we have not evolved any criteria that a digital facsimile ought to satisfy in order to be called a facsimile. How similar is similar enough? What information should a digitized surrogate carry in order to convey an appropriate sense of the scale, the materiality, the colors, and the tactile experience of the so-called original object? Nobody knows, because we don't really talk about this, even though it's crucial for the purpose of research and the precision of our references. We'd rather dream of automation and simulation.
Imagine if we could extract all the information contained in the daily newspapers for the last 200 years. That's a lot of information. However, that will never be enough. If we want to create a past as dense as the present, we need to do something else. We need to do what historians do, extrapolate. In computer science, we call that simulation.
Don't get me wrong, there are good examples for well-informed simulations of a place and a time in the past. I especially like the medieval Angkor Wat project. And a visualization doesn't have to be 3D to fall into the simulation category. Most scholarship in the humanities engages in reconstructive efforts to a certain degree because it has to infer some things based on contextual information in order to jump over gaps and lacunae in the record that we have. When it's done well, it can serve as a base for further discussion or prove enlightening in its illustrative effect. There is, however, a difference between imagining something and giving it an image for others to see, and this is also a problem that documentaries and period dramas face. The more these images slip into the mind of the general public, the more difficult they are to remove from this collective memory, even when people know that what they are watching and experiencing is only fiction. I've been playing every game of the Assassin's Creed series for many years, and even wrote a paper in my Latin philology classes because of it, so I don't think that the popularity of histotainment is necessarily a bad thing, but the lines can blur, and not every person is going to be inspired to educate themselves. Simulations are persuasive because they purport to close a spatio-temporal distance. But as scholars, we're not supposed to travel in time when we study the record. We're bound to our own timelines and frameworks of mind, and we cannot remove that. We cannot pretend that there is a simulated scenario that does not reflect on us more than it does on what it ought to portray. How could anyone know which part of the simulation is based in the evidence and which part is the extrapolation, short of reading extensive documentation, which a member of the public is unlikely to do? And who would we be doing this for if not for the public? We would not be able to base any of our own arguments on the simulation, since it can only emerge from them. And yes, I know that there's a relation between modeling something and simulating it, and I think we should be very careful not to confuse the two, despite their relation and because of their relation. Finally, there's a reality to these things. I've shown you parts of a TED Talk about the Venice Time Machine project from 2014. In 2019, the project came to an abrupt halt for reasons that I can only speculate about. Media reports suggested that it had to do with unresolved copyright issues over the digitization of the materials in the State Archive of Venice. There was also talk about the metadata gathered in the project not satisfying archival standards, although the researchers denied this, so it seems like there was something going on behind the scenes. Whatever the case, the project was shelved as far as I can tell, and certainly the Swiss press was very eager to point out the costs that had been sunk into this and the failure that the project represented in their eyes ultimately. I think the people behind the project should be commended for having been ambitious, But this goes to show how difficult it is to actually implement something of this scope. When we talk about extracting information from the record, we're often talking about person names, place names, and dates, and this is already a non-trivial task, although we're talking about identifying some of the most basic information, basic to the human eye and mind at least. There are those who would argue that scholarship in the humanities doesn't even start there, that is something that happens before any scholarship happens, before any deeper analysis happens. I don't agree with this, but scholarship in any case relies on it or might rely on it depending on what you're doing. So it is a question of money, it is a question of time, it is a question of infrastructure, especially when we're talking long term, and therefore it is ultimately a question of politics. There's an anecdote that I want to share. I was at a symposium in 2019 about the future of the humanities. There were panels on environmental humanities, global humanities, digital humanities. That was an interesting session, but I don't want to talk about that. Among the invited guests was a high-ranking member of the NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities, a funding agency in the US. This representative of the NEH said a few interesting things, but the most interesting was definitely the following. He explained, and I'm quoting from my contemporaneous notes, that the sciences have done a terrific job at arguing how they are crucial for national security, and that the humanities would get more funding from the government if they only made the case for how they are important for keeping the peace and winning wars. I'm not going to comment on this, I'm just going to put that out there. Maybe something to think about. I feel like it's difficult to talk about the digital humanities without acknowledging that for many people, their perception of the field is connected to their perception of technology as such. And a lot of it is rooted in these very primal distinctions of man and machine or nature versus artifice that we see in popular culture.
We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. The very nature of these inventions cries out for the goodness in men. Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men with machine minds and machine hearts. You are not machines, you are not cattle, you are men.
That doesn't really cut it though, does it? The first step should be to realize that we're all in this together, at least those of us who see the purpose of research in learning, knowing, understanding, and explaining to no one in particular, or to those who impress upon us how we cannot explain what we never studied. The second step would be to mind the saying, don't trust any statistics you didn't fake yourself, or rather, don't trust any data you didn't create yourself, or examine yourself for that matter. The third step would be to reflect on all that we lack and to acknowledge the loss. To think about what analog means, what digital means, and what either mean to us. The fourth step would be to extrapolate, to trace the origin of our argument, to lay it bare so it may be refuted, to enter into the conversation that academia ultimately is or ought to be. And there are more steps, many more. Originally, I wanted to wrap this up by giving recommendations or sketching a way forward, but who am I to do that? I often wonder why we do what we do, and what it is that I do. I'm not quite sure yet. What is life? What is this record? Something that has survived throughout the centuries, accidentally or intentionally, traces, scraps, tomes, monuments, documents, generation to generation. Perhaps we study it because it connects us to something bigger than ourselves, something that we can understand or try to, the remnants of human life that came before. Evidence of a history, our history, their history, the presence of thought and mind, heart and soul, society and solitude, whatever you want to call it, networks, patterns, events, sentiments. These traditions lie beneath our fingertips to tell us, in response to our prompting, of an existence that has long since ceased to be. That's what cultural heritage is all about, isn't it? Seeing fractured pieces of our experience with the world, with living, reflected in a time and space beyond our reach. But we are reaching, and there might come a point where we are pulled into the fantasies that we've built of a past we can never truly know. I wonder what happens then. Okay, that's enough drama for now. Back to being a dispassionate scholar. Or maybe that's just a German thing.
東京サタデーナイト小雨の空港最終便が今頃愛を乗せて飛び立つのさ突然あなたは背中を向けて今夜立つと小さく肩震わせた